Hey, hope everybody's been having a great time so far. I am here with you to talk about everyone's favorite topic, probably especially right now, which is hiring. So, just to start, you might be wondering about the meaning of my talk title, which is Tech Hiring is Broken. So, let's start with that. If you Google the phrase tech hiring is broken, you'll find about 16.8 million results. That's a pretty big number. So obviously, folks in our industry care about this and they're talking about it a lot. Collectively, we're not happy with the way that we hire. And in working on this talk, I've read a lot of these articles, and within them, there are two main themes. One is that long interviews make candidates feel their time is being wasted. And conversely, interviewers don't want to do the things that candidates suggest, like reviewing personal projects or open source contributions to get a sense of the candidate's abilities. And then the second thing is that technical screens, especially whiteboarding and live coding, are universally hated by candidates. And I did give a version of this talk in 2019, or at least one with the same title. And when I did this Google search at that time, these themes were largely the same, which would imply that little has changed. But the thing is that tech hiring has changed so much in the past few years. Take home exercises, for example, have become much more popular. In many places, traditional whiteboarding is a lot less common. And yet, it's true that interviews are still long, and perhaps they've actually gotten worse. And our new favors of text screens, while they're better in theory, can be just as bad if done poorly. A badly structured take home, for example, can be extremely time consuming, frustrating, or both. So it's not that I disagree with the gripes we have with hiring processes, but they don't address why tech hiring is broken. These are the symptoms and not the disease. The problem is that we aren't defining goals for the process, and the result is long, sometimes disjointed, and difficult interviews. Take a moment to just talk about who I am and why I'm here to talk to you about this today. I'm Nicole Tibaldi. I'm a senior engineering manager at the New York Times, and interviewing and hiring are passions of mine. I've overhauled or created hiring processes at about 6 different companies, and I've hired for roles from DevOps to front end and early career engineers to engineering managers. So I've learned some things that I would love to share. If what we need to fix tech hiring are goals, what should those goals be? What would make a hiring process better? I believe there are around 3, and while they do have some overlap, it's worth calling them out individually. First, a hiring process should be skills based. And what I mean by that is that we should be evaluating realistic job related skills, not giving quizzes or asking candidates to solve puzzles. Next, a skills-based process should be level and role specific. We should be equally realistic about what folks might know if they're applying for a front-end role or a full stack role or an engineering manager role. And we should be aware of what it means to work at different levels, like principal engineer versus an associate or junior engineer. The skill sets of candidates for these different types of roles will be quite different. Some candidates will have a long work history to pull from, and others won't. Some will have broad sets of skills, and others will be a lot more narrowly scoped. But if we're intentional about what we expect from candidates, we can adjust our interviews accordingly. And last, but perhaps most importantly, a hiring process should be inclusive and achievable by people with different job situations or work histories, and candidates of different genders, races, and cultural backgrounds. Building diverse teams and giving everyone a fair chance should be a core part of everything we do. In a moment, I'm going to share some specific strategies for how to build a process around those goals. But first, I'd like to talk about what can happen when the goals we discussed aren't taken into consideration, or worse, when a hiring process doesn't have any specific goals other than hopefully getting someone in the door. So a while back, I took an engineering manager interview where the role was advertised as team management of a decent sized team with something like 5 to 6 engineers, combined with some percentage of hands-on front end work. This actually fit really well with my skills and experience, and I was pretty excited about it. First, I talked with the hiring manager, and then I had a long meeting with recruiting to review my career history. I completed a technical screen, and I had a conversational interview about software development practices with another manager in the organization. So at that point, I was 4 rounds in, and I felt like things were going really well. I was then asked to come in for a full day on-site with 2 more technical screens, a team lunch, 2 separate conversations with different cross-functional partners, and another interview with the hiring manager. First of all, this time commitment was out of control. By the end of the process, I did something like 8 hours of active interviewing, and I really don't even know how long the process was end to end, including like breaks, lunch, and commute time. The interviews themselves, though, were worse. The technical screens were all over the place. 2 were pretty standard, the kind of thing that we hate, jump through hoops, whiteboard type exercises. And the last was a system design interview. Not a single one of these touched on any front end topics, which is the thing that I was told I would be coming in to do. The first cross functional interview was the first one of the day, and the interviewer was late, so I was standing outside. When we sat down, she had no idea what role I was interviewing for. When I told her, she didn't know what I meant by that. Another cross-functional partner asked me to answer a question about my strengths and weaknesses. The framing of the question was, if I asked your manager what your greatest weakness was, what would he say? When he realized the mistake he'd made with pronouns, he doubled down. The next thing he said was, your boss is a guy, right? She was not. In my last meeting with the hiring manager, he talked about his preference toward people with specific kinds of education, citing how it made them better under pressure. I practically ran out of the building. And the problem was that no one was evaluating the skills I'd actually need for that job. What about growing people's careers as a manager? What about handling conflict? There was very little thought about the technical work I would be doing. I never got to demonstrate my front-end expertise either, though it had been a requirement for the role. And wow, was that process ever not inclusive. The demands of my time were really high. Several comments made me uncomfortable. The full day on-site required me to take a day off from work, not to mention the pressure of performing in all-day interviews with no break, not even for lunch, because I had to be on then too. This probably sounds ridiculous enough that you'd suspect I'm making it up, and I assure you I am not. It's really important to note the impact of that experience too. I would never recommend that company to anyone, though with a couple of exceptions, a lot of the problems were likely due to disorganization rather than malicious intent. So let's jump back to talking about strategies for achieving the goals we discussed so your interview process doesn't look like that. What exactly can we do to make sure we're prioritizing our goals at each stage of the process? Anyone who knows me will tell you that I'm not an artist, but I did include a bit of iconography to represent our 3 goals. So from left to right here, we want our process to be skills-based, level and role specific, and inclusive. You'll see these icons at the bottom of each slide to connect the idea back to our goals. Some of them are kind of a bit hard to tease apart or cover multiple goals. Regardless, the idea is to be thoughtful about what we're doing and why. And that's a useful exercise generally. If you can't identify why you're doing something at any given stage, it's worth questioning that part of the process. So before we do anything else, we need to prepare for kicking things off by putting together a job description. If we're going to be clear about what we want out of the process, all of that will start here. First, in our job description, we want to use inclusive language and consider the impact of any details we provide. If we want diverse teams, which require diverse pools of applicants, we need to make our job descriptions inviting for everyone. And the language that we use matters. We should avoid gender-specific terms or even gender-coded words like rock star or ninja. Another thing that impacts inclusion is using jargon. It's likely to favor folks who have specific work or personal backgrounds if there's a lot of jargon in your job description. The company's mission, the role, and the requirements should be really clear to anybody who reads the job posting, regardless of their background. When you have a final draft, have others read the job description and validate that it's clear and communicates the right intent. There are also tools you can use to point out poor language in job descriptions, Textio, Data People, and they're not perfect, but I've used them before and they definitely do help. If you want to collect even more data, you can experiment by doing things like A/B testing different details in your descriptions. I once worked with somebody who did this, and the results were really interesting and surprising. For example, it turned out that our language around time zones and working hours was confusing, and it was causing qualified candidates to self-select out. This is a little bit time consuming, but it's worth the investment, and it can be whatever you find out can be reused every time you open a new role. Next, in our job description, I'd recommend focusing on skills rather than years of experience or education. I and probably most of you have known many successful engineers and engineering leaders who don't have a computer science degree or who went to a boot camp or who are entirely self-taught. Many of us have learned a ton of new skills on the job, and your candidates will have done that too. Their education is not the only indicator of potential success. Also, avoid setting hard requirements on years of experience. While it is true that certain roles will require a candidate to have more or less experience, the specific roles they've had, the circumstances at their companies, and their individual experiences at those jobs are much more likely to have influenced what they learned than just the length of time they've been working. Next, we want to decide on minimum requirements and make those clear. It's very easy to jump to making a laundry list of every quality the ideal candidate would have. This isn't necessarily a bad exercise for your own purposes, but we can't stop there. It's important to determine which are the must-haves and which are nice-to-haves in terms of skills and experience. If we decide to list both groups of qualifications in the job description, and often it might be wise not to, we should make the difference between those must-haves and nice-to-haves very clear. From an inclusion standpoint, people from marginalized groups in tech are much less likely to apply if they don't feel they meet every single requirement. And we want to be transparent about what the hiring process looks like, ideally in our job description by clearly describing it there. We should include a list of the stages, a brief description of each, and the time commitment they can expect from each one. This will do a lot of things. It will reduce anxiety. It'll allow the candidate to prepare and focus on preparing the right things while they're doing that, and give them time to plan ahead for the number of hours or sessions that your interviews require. If there are accommodations or adjustments that can be made to the process, whether they're in scheduling, format, or anything else, we should list that information as well. This makes it more likely that more people will apply. So to continue being thoughtful about the hiring process, we'll want to do some pre-work for the interviews besides preparing questions and technical screens. First, we want to create scorecards for each stage of the process. As we know, it's important to be conscious of what we're screening for at each stage. And without this guidance, it's easy to start doing things like evaluating irrelevant skills, or worse, introducing bias into your process. We'll want to start by describing what we hope to learn at each stage of the process. And then it's time to break down examples with each of those things of what like an insufficient, sufficient, and exemplary answer to a question might look like. And you can do that to whatever degree of granularity makes sense. It could be just those three, or maybe you have more nuance and you want to break it down further. That's totally fine too. If you have something like a career ladder or some other performance evaluation and promotion mechanism at your company, you'll likely want to map the things that you're looking for in your interviews to those skills. This will provide a higher degree of confidence that the candidate can do the job according to the company's specific expectations. And we want to provide training for interviews. This should happen after you've created your scorecard, and it should be both general and specific. So you want to give interviewers general guidance about how to talk to candidates, language that they should and shouldn't use, guidance on how to format interviews, how to space out things over time, and things like that. Then you'll also want to review the scorecards and ensure that your interviewers understand them. This is how we'll eliminate the potential bias we talked about on the previous slide. Also, for anything submitted async, we want to anonymize the submissions before they're evaluated. Depending on your process, you might have some flavor of an asynchronous submission. I've seen take-home technical exercises, writing exercises, and more. You will reduce bias by finding ways to obscure details about the candidate. Their age, gender, race, work history shouldn't factor into the evaluation of that work. And it's much easier to resist that temptation when that information is just not available. Again, there are tools that can help with this if a manual process feels onerous. It's harder to recommend specific things because it kind of depends on what you're trying to do. But happy to talk about individual examples with anyone. As we're preparing for our interviews, we're going to want to check in with the candidate about scheduling and time commitments. To refer back to my earlier interview story, a full day on site was a really difficult thing for me to schedule at that time. I did make it work, but it's definitely true that others in similar situations might not have been able to do that. On the flip side, it's also possible that a full day arrangement would have been better for someone else. So rather than make assumptions, talk with your candidate and let them know what stages are upcoming and what their options are for pursuing them, and then work with their schedule and preferences to do either one-offs or back-to-backs, remote or on-site as needed, and what you can support. And now we're on to our favorite topic, which is interview questions. Here we'll talk about approaches for everything from technical screens to conversational interviews. So before we talk about any specific step, we want to know that we're focused on building an MVP or a minimum viable process. Uh, as we design the different stages, we want to keep in mind that we should do just as much as we need and no more to allow us to determine if the candidate will be successful in the role. As we know from our Google search results, nobody likes long interviews. It's also true that long, time-consuming hiring processes favor candidates who have time, whether that's because they're not currently employed, or because they don't have children, or because they don't have a second job. Whatever the reason, bogging candidates down with unnecessary steps will immediately eliminate otherwise qualified people. The MVP concept works to the company's advantage too. The faster and more decisive your process is, the more likely candidates will be to reach the end before they've received an offer from another company. Also, we want to create realistic technical screens, and this is one of the kind of key points from the Tech Hiring is Broken articles. If a goal of the hiring process is for it to be skills-based, we should design interviews that represent realistic work that the candidate might do. And when I talk about how interviewing has changed over, especially the past few years, I've seen some really creative technical screens. And I'll give a few examples here. An exercise with a standalone PR where the candidate was asked to do a code review, a system design stage that involved walking through a candidate's work at a prior role rather than talking about a hypothetical system. Tightly scoped take home with like prioritized tasks and feature requests and bug fixes. Pairing exercise, either standalone or as like a follow-up to take home. Code reading interviews, and I'm sure there are a lot more. These all represent real work that a candidate might do as an engineer on a team, and they're also naturally more inclusive. They're tailored toward candidates with relevant work experience rather than those who have time to study algorithms. It's also worth noting that these technical screens are great times not only to evaluate the candidate's ability to write or debug code, but to see how they prioritize, collaborate, and learn. We also want to use different interview stages or questions, whichever is appropriate for folks at different levels. And this can be applied across different types of interviews, wherever it makes sense. To determine this, we'll again want to think about the candidate's role and level and what types of conversations might make sense. And a couple of examples here, an interview stage that might make sense to remove or replace in its entirety, depending on the level, is something like a systems design interview. If you have a candidate applying for a staff engineer role, that's almost certainly a skill you would expect at the staff level. But would you expect that from a junior engineer who's in their first role or maybe even their second? Probably not. And it's fine to remove the stage or replace it with something more relevant. In other cases, you may just want to swap out single questions. Again, as an example, in a non-technical interview, you might ask a more senior engineer to describe when they've led a project or owned a process. It's much less likely that an early career engineer will have done something like that. So instead, you could come up with a different question that talks a little bit about ownership or leadership in a way that makes sense for somebody at that level. We'll also want to avoid open-ended prompts and exercises with loose time constraints. This is generally more applicable to things that are done asynchronously, like take-homes. Um, you're very likely to introduce process bias into your process if you say something like, spend about 3 hours on this and return it in a week. Candidates who have a lot of free time will want to showcase their best work, naturally, and they're very likely to spend more time anyway. Candidates who have other responsibilities, other demands on their time, will be more likely to plan to hit the expected time commitment and no more because that's all they can do. Additionally, try not to assign take-home projects that are very open-ended, like asking candidates to create an entirely new app with just a few loose requirements. First of all, they're frustrating. It's much more likely that a candidate will get tripped on something like their Webpack config if they have to start a new project completely from scratch. Um, and also candidates are likely to have to make choices that will result in submissions that are just like completely different. And those will be really difficult to evaluate against the same criteria. And for our interview questions, we want to offer options if possible. If you believe you can fairly evaluate across interviews with different formats and you have options prepared, talk to your candidate. Some folks will feel comfortable with like a more sort of pressure-filled synchronous interview and will prefer that because it's less time consuming. Others will prefer having time to work and think on their own and use the resources that they're accustomed to and will happily absorb additional time to do that. Remember, a diverse team will have diverse personalities and abilities, and this shows up in our interviews as much as anywhere else. Lastly, we'll talk a little bit about decision making. This is the last stage of putting together our process, and what we want to do is think about, with the information we've gathered, how can we best decide if we can hire someone? One thing to be careful of, we want to structure our debriefs and feedback sessions to avoid groupthink. It's not inherently a problem to have these, but they need to be carefully handled. Encourage participants to keep interview notes and to submit written feedback or their like rating or recommendation ahead of any debrief session. When individuals hear the experiences and opinions of other people, they're likely to be influenced by what they're hearing and might feel tempted to change their mind. Make it clear to your interviewers that they should not discuss interviews and interview feedback with one another prior to having a debrief session. This can also introduce bias. We also want to offer feedback to a candidate. This is an area where I often hear a lot of hesitation, and it's true that it can be sensitive. However, when a candidate has invested time and energy participating in the process, it's good practice to offer them clear, actionable, and objective feedback. So make an effort to do this to whatever extent your company allows it. And remember that candidates who are being offered a role will also be glad to receive feedback. If they know what they've done well in the process, they'll be able to start their new role with greater confidence in what's important to their new team or their manager. And in the end, we'll also want to collect data about candidate performance. One thing we'll never be able to stop doing is trying to build better processes. So if you track things like success rate and performance in interviews from your debriefs, it'll tell you a lot about how successful your hiring practice is. Once I received some really great feedback from a candidate when I worked at a company that had been doing like a take-home exercise. She had struggled with it a lot and sent us an email kind of letting us know that it felt unfair for somebody at her level. And it turned out that she was quite right. And we were able to use that feedback to develop a more reasonable interview. So also take that kind of feedback on board and put it into practice if it feels valid. So those are all the specific suggestions I have for developing a process. Since we started off with a negative experience and we've talked about what we can do differently, we should conclude with what a positive interview experience might look like. And I have two short examples. One, some years ago, I interviewed for a job at a startup, and I was blown away by how thoughtful their process was. My early conversations with the hiring manager were really transparent. And at the time, I was much earlier in my career, and this manager made it clear that while I didn't have a ton of years of experience, the team was impressed with my background and they thought that I would do well in the process. That made me feel confident that we were aligned about the stage I was at my career and that it was within bounds for what they were looking for. The technical screen was super reasonable. It was a take-home exercise, but it was tightly scoped and time-bound. I had to choose a window of time in which to complete it and send it back, which meant I was on equal footing with other candidates. As I advanced through the stages, I was offered feedback on what I'd done well, and this allowed me to continue to calibrate and build confidence in myself. My interviewers were respectful, and it was apparent that they had a good understanding of what they were looking for while they were talking to me. I did take that role, and I was just as happy in that job as I imagined I'd be when my interviews were complete. Then the last thing I'll note is that candidates can have positive experiences when they aren't offered the role too. At another of my previous companies, I interviewed a bunch of candidates for an engineering manager position. Our process was pretty carefully designed, and while it was far from perfect, candidates seemed to enjoy it. After we'd arrived at a decision and made an offer, one of the candidates we regretfully passed on wrote us a note to tell us how much he had enjoyed the process. He felt he learned from it and that it might contribute to future success, and he clearly felt that he could recommend our company to others who were looking for new roles. So in conclusion, I hope this makes you feel that while it may be true that tech hiring is broken, it's within our power to fix it, and there are some things that are going well. Thanks for joining me, and please feel free to reach out with questions or comments. I'll try to also answer some questions in the chat after we wrap up here.